Good evening. Hello. Welcome everyone to our Meet the Author presentation. My name is Carla Eastis. I am the Director for First Year Programs in the University's Office of Undergraduate Education. And in the audience tonight, we have UNC Charlotte students from across town and across the world, faculty and staff from all parts of the university, and guests from the Charlotte community who have come to learn with us. And on behalf of the university, I thank you all for attending, and I look forward to sharing this experience with you. Fall 2019 marks the 13th year of the UNC Charlotte Common Reading Experience program. This is a project that helps first-year students transition to and engage with the university. It's just one of the UNC Charlotte programs that helps students stake their claim and find their own way to success in college and beyond. Each year, a dozen or so committee members of the Common Reading Selection Group examine a tall stack of books, and we're looking for a text that will be engaging as well as educational. Spare Parts, Four Undocumented Teenagers, One Ugly Robot, and The Battle for the American Dream by Joshua Davis was the committee's selection for fall 2019. Spare Parts presents, in part, a classic feel-good tale, but it's also got explorations of education and learning, immigration and race, and the very idea of being American. It's funny, honest, sad, and absolutely compellingly written. About 400 students are reading Spare Parts as part of their coursework in first-year seminars, liberal studies courses, or first-year writing courses. They're using the book as a basis for assignments that build critical thinking skills and an understanding of diverse perspectives. But the most exciting part of the Common Reading experience each year is the author's campus visit. And we are absolutely delighted to have come to that point in this semester. So, on with the program. Originally from Baltimore, Maryland, Saad Jalisi is currently a freshman and religious studies major here at UNC Charlotte. At the university, Saad is a member of the prestigious Levine Scholars program, and he sings bass with Kodachrome a cappella. In his future life as a 49er, Saad hopes to spend more time engaging with our campus and city through community service. Please welcome Saad Jalisi to the podium.
Thank you for that introduction. What is the American dream? Is it an epic meant to portray the greatness of meritocracy in every American age? Is it an ideal that we Americans should strive for, the nice house, white picket fence, 2 kids and a dog? Or is it all just a children's tale? Maybe, but before we can answer any of those questions, we must confront 2 concepts. What does it mean to be an American? And what does it mean to dream? The late Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had a dream, and so did San Francisco City Supervisor Harvey Milk. And I have dreams, and I hope you all have dreams too. However, how accessible are these dreams, and can 4 undocumented teenagers dream as we can? Good evening, my name is Saad Jalisi. I'm from Baltimore, Maryland. I'm a freshman, majoring in religious studies, and welcome to the 2019 Fall Common Reading regarding Spare Parts by Joshua Davis. In this New York Times bestseller, Davis tackles the harsh yet inspiring realities of Christian, Lorenzo, Oscar, and Luis, the 4 undocumented teenagers I referenced earlier. Through their stories, I received insight into the notion of having 2 identities, especially American and Mexican, and specifically the blatant legal dismissal of one's Americanness. While the issue of identity remains a central motif in Spare Parts, much of this novel is dedicated to exploring one's identity. As the 2004 Marine Advanced Technology Education ROV competition states, quote, exploration means discovery of the new and the unexpected, end quote. To explore is to dive into the depths of the unknown, even in seemingly the darkest of times. So whether you're like Oscar, who's denied an army enlistment due to his citizenship status, or Christian, who is isolated from his peers from a young age due to his smaller stature and allergies, or Lorenzo, who experiences bullying as a result of his head misshapen injury, or you're like Luis, who unintentionally intimidates others due to his quiet demeanor and large physical size. This book underscores the importance of continuously exploring what life can offer, because you never know when robotics might even shed light into your life. For the author of this wondrous novel, Mr. Joshua Davis is an American writer, film producer, and co-founder of Epic magazine. Although Mr. Davis may be best known for his literary work, I personally admire his own pursuits of diverse exploration. For example, Mr. Davis has tracked rumors of genetically modified cocaine behind rebel lines in Colombia. He's investigated the world's largest diamond heist and hunted the source of a cyber war in Russia. While Mr. Davis's achievements are clearly outstanding, I appreciate the breadth of his work. In my humble opinion, I believe that the range of Mr. Davis's life shows passion for exploration and discovery. These extraordinary examples show how Mr. Davis's exploration has shaped his identity as a trailblazer, how he can impact the world around him, and that he is more than a writer. So, without further ado, please give a warm UNC Charlotte welcome to Mr. Joshua Davis.
Thank you, Saad. I don't think I'm going to live up to that. All right. Well, that was great. None of it's true. What I want to talk about today, I'm going to give you a little bit of the background on, Saad was saying that I'm a trailblazer, but the truth is that I had no idea what I was doing with my life when I was your age. So I want to talk a little bit about that and how my career developed such that I ended up writing this book. And then I'll talk a little bit about the book, and raise your hand if you've read the book. Okay, that was a trick question, right? I think you were all supposed to have read it, right? Okay, so a good number of you have. And then we'll talk a little bit about where everybody is at now, and then we'll talk about whatever you want to talk about, take questions. So, as Saad said, I am a journalist with a clicker that doesn't work. Maybe you could just advance it for me. So I've spent most of my career, certainly the first 10 years of my career, writing for Wired, which is a tech magazine. I don't necessarily consider myself a tech writer. I write about people, and my job is essentially to travel around the world, find interesting people who have had an unusual experience, or normal people who have had an unusual experience, and then write about it. So I typically don't write, I'm not like a daily news reporter. I don't cover stories on an ongoing basis. I go into somebody's world and I'll spend months and in some cases years trying to understand who they are and why they did what they did. Every now and then I'll cross paths with famous people. I've spent a lot of time writing about Elon Musk. So if you want to talk about Tesla afterwards, you can ask me a question about Tesla. But as I said a second ago, I didn't intend to go into journalism. I didn't study it. Do you guys have a journalism program here, undergrad? No. Anybody want to be a journalist? 1, 2. Yeah, it's a messed up profession. It's really not a good choice. We'll get into that. But when I was in college, I didn't know what I wanted to do. There were a lot of things that were interesting to me, and I ended up studying economics. You do have an econ program or like a business, probably? Anybody in econ? A few. What do you guys all do? Nobody's raising their hands. What about teachers? Anybody want to be teachers? Phew. Okay, what is the most popular course here? Psychology, raise your hand. Well, there we go. Biology. Okay, now I get it. Okay. So for me, I was studying economics, and I chose a particular discipline in econ called macroeconomics. So micro is like how businesses run, macro is how nations run. And so when I graduated, I was qualified, perhaps, to run a small country. But there's not a lot of countries that are hiring. So I was unemployed when I came out of college. And I ended up getting a job. I'm from San Francisco. I grew up in San Francisco. So I went home after college. And I got a job at the phone company. And it was this weird job. It was a data entry job. And everybody in the state of California would get their phone bill, and you could check a box if you were below a certain income level and qualify for a reduced phone bill. And so my job was, you would send that in, and I would get these stacks, and there was just a room the size of this filled with all these stacks of people who would check the box. And I would just type your phone number in, one after the other, all day long, just typing those numbers in. And the weird thing was that if I got the number wrong, the machine would beep at me, which suggested that it already knew what the number was. And if it already knew what the number was, then what was I doing there, right? If the whole point was that the numbers are already in the system, then what was my job? And it occurred to me that maybe it was a psychological experiment, and they were just waiting to see when I would lose my mind. And I basically was, and I was looking around, there's cameras, and this went on for months. And so it was around that time that I saw a flyer for the U.S. National Arm Wrestling Championship. We were talking about this at dinner. And, you know, I was at a kind of weak point in my life. Things hadn't turned out the way I wanted. I didn't have a job that I liked. I was making minimum wage. You know, and so I see this and I think, well, maybe on the weekend I can go have an adventure and do something different and something interesting and exciting. And so I drove down to Laughlin, Nevada, which is not a great place. Anybody been to Laughlin? We're on the other side of the country here, so I don't expect nobody. Oh, one! I'm sorry. Yeah, it's a tough place. Did you gamble? No, you're a freshman. You probably can't. Yeah. Well, yeah. So the U.S. National Arm Wrestling Championship was at the Avi Hotel Resort and Casino, and I show up and there's a table outside of the auditorium, and I say, "Where do I buy a ticket?" And they say, "You're a spectator?" I'm like, "Yeah." And they're like, "Well, there aren't really, you can just watch, but you've driven all this way." I drove from San Francisco to Laughlin is maybe, I don't know, it's like 10 hours. It's a long drive. And so I get there and they're like, "Well, why don't you enter? It's only $20. And I had $20 and I thought, okay. So I gave them the $20 and I had to sign this release that said if my body got broken, it was my fault, but fine. And so I said to them, "But look, I don't know anything about arm wrestling. I'd wrestled my brother when we were kids and he beat me. And so I didn't have any qualifications." And so they introduced me to this guy named Rick Salawada, who was a middleweight world champion. And he had just arrived via Greyhound. And I don't know what you guys think about arm wrestlers. I had some preconceptions. I thought they were just like huge dudes who wanted to break people and had anger issues. And so I didn't know what to think when I met Rick. He did seem quite angry. It turns out, I learned this later, that he took a week off every year to compete at nationals, and he only had enough money to take Greyhound, and so in this case, from Erie, Pennsylvania, where he's from, to Laughlin is like 2.5 days, 2 days, and he had deliberately decided to stop smoking before he got on the bus, so that when he got to Laughlin, he'd be super pissed off. And so that's when I met him. He was very angry. But he took me, under his wing, so to speak, for 5 or 10 minutes. And arm wrestling, it turns out, is quite easy to learn the basics. There's the inside move and the outside move. And there's certain instances where you use this, the inside, and certain instances, the outside. He ran me through it in 5 minutes and says, "Good luck, kid." So it's a double elimination event. I get called up for my first match. I get beat. No surprise, right? But now I think I've got a sense of how to do it. I get up for my second match, and I get beat. So I lost twice, and I'm out. No surprise. That's what I expected to have happen. I go back. I'm having some beers with Rick and Jeff Tomchason, the reigning heavyweight world champion. We're having a good time at the end of the event, and they start the award ceremony on the stage, and I hear out of the corner of my ear the announcer start with a lightweight division. I, by the way, was in the lightweight division. And they say, fourth place in the United States, Joshua Davis, get on up here. And I'm like, what are you talking about? I lost all my matches. And they wave me, and so I get up, and they put a medal around my neck. And they say, congratulations, you were 4th out of 4. There were only 3 other competitors in the lightweight division. And it turned out that that made me an alternate for the U.S. National Arm Wrestling Championship. And when numbers 2 and 3 couldn't leave the country because they were on probation, they were forced by their bylaws to invite me to become part of Team USA, and I went to Poland to represent America at the World Arm Wrestling Championship, and there I am with Jeff Tomchason, where I ended up 17th in the world out of 18. And the 18th guy never showed up. So I've actually never won a competitive arm wrestling match in my life, but somehow I ended up 17th in the world. Just because for this weird, I saw a flyer and I thought, why not go? And so I get home, back to San Francisco, feeling pretty good. I did, by the way, I beat the Canadian lightweight woman in a demonstration match, so that was my one win. But so I get home and I see my neighbor in the hallway of my apartment building. He's like, hey, where you been? I haven't seen you for a while. I said, oh, I was arm wrestling in Poland. And he's like, what? And so I told him what happened. And it turns out that Bill, who had just moved in next door to me because he was getting a divorce, was the executive editor at Wired. And he said, that sounds like a magazine story. Why don't you write it? And I said, well, I don't know. I studied macroeconomics. What do I know? And he goes, well, it's pretty simple. You write a 2-paragraph summary of your story, you email it to an editor, and if they like it, they just pay for it. They don't care what you studied or where you went to school. If you have a good story to tell, then that's it. That's all it takes. That's the only barrier to entry. And so I was like, okay. So I wrote it up and ended up placing the story in Maxim, of all terrible places. But that's how I got my first shot at being a journalist. And I thought, oh, this is interesting. I could actually continue to travel and meet people like Rick Salawada and Jeff Tomchason. And, I retired from arm wrestling, so I didn't continue doing that. But then this was in 2003, and it was in the run-up to the war in Iraq, the second Gulf War. And so I went to Bill at Wired and the other editors, and I said, look, I've been doing some research. There is a unit in the military. Any veterans in the audience? No? God, I'm striking out tonight. Oh, there's one. Thank you. There was this unit in the Army, the Signal Corps, and their job traditionally was to put an antenna up so that radio communications could happen on the battlefield and elsewhere. And now the 2003 war was the first war of the internet era. So how does that change how wars are fought? How does that change the Signal Corps? And I said, I could write a sidebar on your war coverage. And they said, well, actually, we don't have anybody covering the war. I was like, well, this is obviously our national magazine is the most important thing of perhaps the decade. Somebody's got to cover it. Why not me? And at that point, they did ask for my qualifications. And I said, well, I'm 4th place in the United States with my right arm, and I'm 17th in the world. But they didn't have anybody else. So I ended up in Iraq covering the war for Wired. And all the real journalists were like, who are you? And how did you get here? This was outside of Fallujah. That guy in the upper left is just about to shoot that truck behind me. It was a very intense experience that I was not prepared for. When I got back and I wrote the story about how the Signal Corps operates, Wired put me on staff. And that's how I became a journalist. So obviously I planned it entirely. I knew exactly what I was doing at every step. No. One of the results of being a national magazine journalist is that people start pitching you stories. I would start getting a lot of press releases, and I still, to this day, they're crazy, many of them. Like, I somehow got on the National Berry Association list, so every month it's like National Blueberry Month. And the blueberry people are particularly aggressive. They're like, how are you planning on covering National Blueberry Month? And I'm like, well, I'm not. They're like, why not? And I'm like, well, I don't know. What is there to say? But 2004, I come back from Iraq. Excuse me, I'm a little sick, by the way, so I apologize for coughing. I get back from Iraq, and I get this email. So when I'm getting these press releases, I'm usually like delete, delete, delete. Terrible. I'm not covering Blueberry Month. There was like a National Underwear Day, just nonsense. And then I get this one press release from a high school in Phoenix, and the press release is terrible in many ways. One way that it was terrible is, you know when you get those emails and they're formatted weird so that like it's all on one line, you gotta scroll over, and then you go back and there's one word and then you gotta scroll over. It was like that. So there's some major formatting and there was typos. And so I was about to press delete, but just the fact that I was getting a press release from a high school was unusual, and that kind of made me hesitate. Said, you know what, I'm not gonna delete it, but I moved on. I think that was in October of '04. And then in November, December, popped back into my head for some reason, like, what was that high school press release? And so I dug it up. There was a phone number on it, and I called it, and I got through to Freddie Lajvardi, who is the teacher, as many of you know, of the Carl Hayden, the mentor, one of the mentors of the Carl Hayden robotics team. And the first thing he said was, somebody called. And I'm like, he's like, you got the press release? I was like, yeah. And he said, it's amazing. You called. And I was like, well, yeah, because your press release sucked. It was a terrible press release. He told me he had sent it out to hundreds of journalists, and I was the only one who had responded. And so then he kind of explained that they had built this robot, they had gone to this competition, they went up against the best collegiate teams as high schoolers, and I didn't quite know what to make of it. So I said, you know what, I'll come out, I'll fly out there. And so I flew out in January of '05, and when I landed, this is what I saw. And I thought, I have made a mistake. I was like checking the flights, see how quickly I can get back to San Francisco, because I was like, it's got a briefcase is somehow glued on top of it, and it's got a tape measure, and there's string, and it's PVC pipe, and it's all messy paint. So I thought I was wasting my time. And then I met the team, and Oscar on the far left started to explain to me, for instance, on the robot on Stinky, you'll see the white thing with the zip tie on it. That's a gallon jug of milk. That's a milk jug that they had cut in half and zip tied to the thing. And as some of you will remember, they were trying to solve the problem of if you're filling a balloon with water underwater and then you pull the machine out of the water, the balloon falls over and all the water that you've pumped into the balloon spills out. So how do you solve this? And they said, we need like a mitt. And somebody saw a milk jug in the garbage, saw it in half, and it's got a hole in the bottom where the milk would normally pour out. You put the balloon in there, and it fills up inside the jug. It's a pretty smart idea, actually. So as they started to talk about what this thing represented and how they had built it, I started to think a little bit more deeply about it. And then they opened up the briefcase. And I was like, I have misjudged. I have misjudged what this is. There is a lot more going on here than I previously understood. And that is something that held true for me as I reported the story over the last decade. I initially followed them in the beginning of 2005, and at that point they had this great victory. They had gone to Santa Barbara. They had successfully beaten many collegiate teams, including MIT. I think you can. This is what they look like after beating MIT. And yet, when I met them in January and February of '05, Oscar, who had graduated from high school, was putting up drywall. And Luis was working as a file clerk, and Christian and Lorenzo were still in school, but they didn't have any plans to go to college. And that struck me as strange. these guys had just proven that they were amongst the best engineers in the country, and yet they either weren't going to college or didn't plan to go to college. So when I wrote this article, this was the original article. It was called La Vida Robot. A number of things happened. Readers started emailing me saying, hey, we would like to help these students, try to get the education that they deserve, and where could they send a check? And at first I gave them the wired address because I didn't quite know what to do. And so, but pretty quickly there were too many checks coming in. And I called Freddie and Alan and got connected to Phoenix Unified School District, who set up a scholarship fund, and the readers of the magazine ended up sending over $100,000 in to support these 4 students. And something that again, to the point of like, what did I think at the beginning and what did I end up learning? At first I thought this was just a story of 4 kids from a school that perhaps was not as well funded as other schools, who had built a robot using nothing, garbage. But when I asked them what was it like to go to Santa Barbara, what was it like to see the ocean for the first time, one of the things they told me was the ocean was great, but they were scared. I was like, well, scared of what? Like a tsunami? And they're like, eventually one of them told me we're undocumented. And this was in '05, and nowadays it's very much a topic of conversation. But back then it was not. It was not okay to say you were undocumented. It was very dangerous. You could get deported. It was a climate of real uncertainty. The Dreamer movement hadn't taken off. And so this admission on their part was a dangerous admission. And as I learned more about their family lives and the decision that they made to go to this competition, it struck me that this fact of being undocumented was core to the story. They were risking so much by even going to this. They, as many of you know from reading it, they hit a immigration checkpoint on the way back, and they got through it, but they very well could have been detained and deported. And that struck me as a big decision. Like, how many things in your life would you say, okay, I am going to go to this soccer game, even if it means that I'm going to get torn away from my parents and sent to a country that I don't know? Would you go? How many things do you have in your life that are that meaningful to you, that you would risk everything? For these 4 students, they made that decision, and they were roughly your age. So when it came time to write the story, I went to them and said, look, I think that the fact that you guys are undocumented is central to the story, and if I don't write about it, I wouldn't be telling the truth. But at the same time, I recognize that it's a difficult and dangerous thing, and 2 of them were minors at the time, under the age of 18. And I would like you to go talk to your parents and ask permission, if it's okay for me to do this. The 2 teachers, Freddie and Alan, said to the students, absolutely not. We don't care what your parents say. If you were our kids, we would not let you do this. It's basically putting a giant target on your back. Don't forget that in 2005, Joe Arpaio was the sheriff of Phoenix, Maricopa County, and was very aggressively trying to tamp back on illegal immigration. So this was a dangerous thing to do. They went back that night to talk to their parents. They came in the next day and said to me, Oscar, said, we've all talked about it. We talked to our parents. and we feel like this is a Rosa Parks moment. This is a moment when you do not just say okay, when you do not move, when you, I'm paraphrasing now, but stand up for what's right. And they said, we want you to write it. We want you to write the truth. And so I did. Interestingly, the editors at Wired were like, what is all this immigration stuff? What does this have to do with the story? They wanted me to take it out. Like, this is a technology magazine. But I wrote it in, very much the story that you guys have read in the book. And one of the impacts was that the scholarship fund was raised, but on the other hand, there was, and I perhaps, and most likely not related, but the voters in Arizona then passed a number of bills that made it harder to be an immigrant in Arizona. They raised tuition on undocumented students. So Oscar, who was at ASU at the time, his tuition tripled. Christian's tuition also tripled. Oscar was a little bit older. He was able to finish. Christian ran out of money and did not finish, dropped out. So on the one hand, I thought, well, telling the story is going to maybe make people understand that these students obviously have an immense amount to contribute. They view themselves as American. They've grown up in America. They went to American schools. They have families in America. They are American. And on the other hand, the dialogue in the country has only gotten more polarized around this issue. When I was writing the book in 2013, 2014, there was a point, and I was almost done with it, and there was a bipartisan agreement on immigration reform in Congress. And it got very close, and I was pretty sure that when the book came out that all of this immigration stuff would be a thing of the past, that we would have figured it out. And we were talking earlier about the book being more of a historical document. But it isn't. It's maybe more relevant now than it was 10 years ago. So the movie came out. Could talk about movies. I've another unforeseen twist in my career. I publish all these stories, and then a number of them have gotten adapted into films and TV shows. This one, most notably. And yet the film, how many of you have seen the film? Okay. Readers, good job. The film, for those of you who've seen it, ends with the competition, right? It ends when everything's happy, they win, MIT is vanquished, right? But that's not really the truth of what happened. The story kept going. Life doesn't end, except when it does. And that's part of the reason why I felt I needed to write the book, because the lasting note shouldn't be that all the problems are solved and everything's great. After the competition, Oscar, after he graduated from ASU, tried to resolve his immigration difficulties and ended up getting banned from the United States for 10 years. Just because he tried to do the right thing. Despite the fact that he was married to an American woman and had a daughter who was American. There was also a documentary, for those of you who are interested, Underwater Dreams. It tells a different angle on the story. It talks about the impact that the 4 students had on subsequent generations, right? Subsequent years on the robotics team. And in particular, it focuses on some of the decisions the teachers made, who are really the unsung heroes in the story. Freddie and Alan were noticing that the teams were getting gendered, kind of divided along gender lines, so that the guys were building the robots and the girls were doing like the posters and the presentations, and Freddie and Alan was like, that's dumb. And so they split the teams into 2 teams, one all guys and one all girls, and ran them separately, all semester long and then force them into a competition against each other, where the girls beat the guys. And at that point, a very interesting decision as a teacher, what do you do now? Do you keep the two teams separate? What they decided to do was split the teams, to recombine them. And the next semester, now the build team was 50-50 men and women, and the poster team was 50-50 men and women. So very interesting kind of pedagogical approach to getting people to think differently about roles and what they can and cannot do. And the film covers that, the documentary. So here they are more recently. As I mentioned, the movie ends on a happy note, and life isn't necessarily happy all the time. Lorenzo and Luis, on the far left, started a catering company together that they called Neither Here Nor There, in reference to their immigration status. And the company has been doing very well, but recently I got a phone call, this is maybe 6 months back or so, that they were arguing with each other, and they would always kind of bicker, but they got into a fight over who made better salsa. And they wanted me to arbitrate. And I was like, yeah, salsa, they're both good. But it was really about something bigger. You know how people start to fight about something little, but it's actually not about that, it's about something else. And it was about how much each of them was contributing to the success of the company. And so recently, Lorenzo bought Luis out of his stake in the company, and they went their separate ways. Oh, no, I was going to finish with so Christian, as I mentioned, his share of the scholarship money ran out when tuition tripled in Arizona. This is back in 2008 maybe. And he went to work for Home Depot for a while. He was living at home and inventing all sorts of crazy things in his bedroom. And he ended up getting another shot at college and went to Michigan State. And made it was a tough thing for him because he was maybe, I want to say 27, 28 at that point. He'd been out of college for a while, and he was going back, and it was all different. Everybody was younger than him. Most everybody was younger. It was also cold. He was from Arizona. He didn't feel comfortable there, and he struggled. And he eventually, in the second year, dropped out the second time, and has not yet completed college. Oscar, second from the right, as I mentioned, was banned from the United States. Senator Dick Durbin, there was a huge outcry about this. Like, this guy is just a stand-up American, and here he is working, he's initially picking beans in a field in Chihuahua after having not only won the National Underwater Robotics Championship, but then going to ASU and starting the ASU Robo-Devils and getting special and unique honors in mechanical engineering, and he's picking beans. So there was a letter writing campaign, and Senator Dick Durbin interceded on his behalf, actually printed up a giant photo of Oscar, walked out onto the floor of the Senate, said, "This is the face of America." The ban was overturned. Oscar came back, and within a number of weeks, enlisted in the U.S. Army. He became a citizen in basic training, was deployed to Afghanistan, served a tour of duty in combat, and is now a mechanical engineer with BNSF, the train company in Texas, and has done extraordinarily well. So it's a complex story. It's not all positive, and it's not all negative. It's the story of America. So, that's all I have to say. But I'm open to your questions, so let's hear what you're interested in. We can talk about arm wrestling, the inside move, the outside move, talk about movies, talk about immigration. Question over here. I'll wait for you for the microphone so everybody can hear you.
Are you ever planning on using your degree in macroeconomics?
Oh, yeah. It's hard to like comb the want ads of Liechtenstein, see if they're hiring. When I read the newspaper, I can understand it perhaps a little bit better when interest rates move. What does that have to do? I still remember, the only formula I remember is C plus I plus G plus X equals something. I can't actually remember the rest of it. These formulas. You don't even need formulas anymore, you got the internet. I started a business, so I should have studied microeconomics, I guess. Yeah.
When you're a journalist, like a lot of people say that a journalist needs to be unbiased, but like with this book, it's obvious that like it's a little bit more written towards these kids. So I guess my question is like how do you decide how much you put yourself into an article or a book?
I don't think, good question. I'm not a character in the book, but I certainly take your point. I try, both in the original article and in the book, to talk to the other side. And there are a number of valid points to be made, and I'll tick through a few of them. You could say that, okay, if we're just going to let people cross the border and then offer them tuition at a subsidized rate, they're taking a spot from somebody who is a citizen, and that's not fair, right? So that's one argument. It presupposes a zero-sum game, which is to say that there's only X amount of money, and oftentimes there is. The argument, you can play through the argument. The next argument I would make, I'm arguing myself, is that imagine what would happen if you let Oscar go to ASU. What kind of wealth is he going to generate for this country? It's not a zero-sum game. So if you say to Oscar, nope, sorry, get the hell out of here, that's a worse outcome than allowing somebody like Oscar to build a business, to create jobs, to generate income, to generate tax revenue that can then expand the pie for everybody. And I would also argue that that's the American dream. So I appreciate that kind of debate, and I'm happy to continue the discussion. I think those are the discussions we should have. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm back here. My question is, can you please go into more detail about the arm wrestling world championship? Like, how long was it, and what did you do there?
Yeah, so it was in Gdynia, Poland, which in January, it was very cold. Gdynia, there's two towns kind of jammed up next to each other, Gdynia and Sopot. And Sopot is most famous for having the longest wooden pier in Poland. So it's a big accomplishment. And this is the site of the World Arm Wrestling Championships. It lasted, I want to say like 4 or 5 days, and I was there for probably 10 days. Between the point that I qualified for nationals and the World Championships, I had about 4 months to get ready. And when I went initially, it was a lark. I was not planning on competing. I was gonna just watch. And so now all of a sudden I come out of the weekend in Laughlin and I'm representing my country, and I have to do my best to represent the country. So I got 2 coaches. I got Wild Bill Serpa, who was the oldest competitive wrestler in the world at the time. And I got Jeff Tomchason in Houston. I flew to Houston to train with him. And I'd only qualified with my right arm. And I was in a certain weight class. So what I ended up doing was like not using this arm at all for 4 months and getting this arm huge. And so I had one giant arm. My friends called me the Claw. And it didn't help. I mean, I still lost all my matches. But I tried. I tried to do my country right. Yeah. Somebody in the way back? Sorry to make you walk. Oh, this gentleman here has a question. Oh, he's got the microphone too.
Since Christian dropped out the second time, have you heard from him?
I've heard very little from him. I spoke to him right after he dropped out, right before and right after. And I need to reconnect with him and find out what's going on. It's been about a year since I talked to him. I talked to Lorenzo last week. I talk to Oscar frequently. When I go to Phoenix, I see Oscar's in Texas now, but I see the other guys. Yeah, they in many ways have become part of my life just because I've been reporting on them for, what is it now, 13, 12 years, something like that. Yeah, 14 years. Sorry, since 05, right? 14 years. It's I've watched them grow up. Yeah. Yeah.
So.
Raise your
yeah.
hand,
Sorry.
whoever's talking. Oh yeah.
So what kind of a role did you play in helping the movie become a thing? Like, did you work with the director, or how exactly did that work?
So the article La Vida Robot is what set it in motion back in 05. That article got bought. It's called, they got optioned, but for intensive purposes, we'll say it got bought by Warner Brothers with the producer named John Wells, who did ER and The West Wing. He was going to produce it, and that went for 3 years, and they wrote a draft of the script that nobody liked, and then they abandoned it, and then Selma Hayek picked it up and took it to MGM and spent 3 years developing it, and she got into a fight with the screenwriters, and they never even wrote a script. And then it got abandoned again. As I was saying at dinner, the film business is a terrible business. Anybody who wants to go into it, don't do it. But if you really want to, talk to me later. And I'll tell you again, don't do it. Because only, my estimate is 3% of projects that go into the development process that get turned into scripts, only 3% of those actually get turned into movies. So you end up spending much of your life developing and trying to create things that never get created. Spare Parts was a happy exception, but it took 10 years. And it wasn't until George Lopez got a deal at Lionsgate and was looking for a meaningful project, picked this up and got Marissa Tomei and Jamie Lee Curtis on and put it together that it finally happened. And I was involved giving feedback and notes along the way and trying to be the advocate for the true story as best I could. One of the main differences, or one of the most notable differences between the book, the true story, and the movie is that they combined the two teachers into one teacher. Freddie Lajvardi and Alan Cameron became Freddie Cameron. And I think part of the logic there was you've got 4 students and 2 teachers, that's 6 characters, you've got roughly 90 or 100 minutes in a film. So if you have to track 6 characters in 90 minutes, it gets a little thin for each of them. The joke on the set was Freddie is of Iranian descent and Alan is of Scottish descent. And so the joke was, what do you get when you cross an Iranian with a Scotsman? You get George Lopez. Yeah, because he played Freddie Cameron. Yeah.
You mentioned your story about how you got involved with Wired. I think it was your neighbor ended up being the senior editor?
Yes,
like
yeah.
That?
Executive editor, yeah.
Executive editor, okay. So, I guess my question is, do you consider that to be normal for the industry, like a normal way to get in?
I haven't met anybody else who got in like I did. Though, there are some careers that have a real obvious career track, like if you want to be a lawyer, you go to law school, and then boom, 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 and doctor. But there are many other careers that are not obvious, and your path into them is not obvious, as it was for me. journalism has changed very dramatically in the last 15 years and even in the last 5 years. The bottom has dropped out of newspapers, newspaper publishing and magazine publishing. And that has meant that it's extremely difficult to make a living doing what I do now, which is a shame because A, it's fun, and B, I think it's important to tell these kinds of stories. But in some ways, it feels like a dying art. Part of what I've done in starting my own company and starting Epic is to try to build a place where this art can survive with a new business model. And we've been relatively successful in doing that. The company was just acquired 5 months ago, and so now for the first time in my life, I'm an employee of a large media organization. But again, it's not always the case that you know exactly what every step of your life is going to look like, and while that can be a little scary, if you knew exactly what was going to happen for the rest of your life, would you want to? Is that a yes, or is that a question? Yeah, it looks like it's a question. I thought she was like, yes, I want to know. Yeah, let's get a microphone over there. Oh, there we go.
Oh goodness, okay. First of all, I love the book. It's
Thank
great. But I wanted to know more about your process. Like, how do you go from not being in the field of journalism to eventually writing your own book that got turned into a movie? I want to know your process.
Sure. This was my third book, so this came somewhat later in my career. I started as a journalist in 2001, 2002, and I was reporting this story from 2004 onward, and I didn't consider. I was always in the back of my head that there could be a book in it. But once I knew that Lionsgate was going to make the film, and I knew what the script was, and I knew that it was going to end with a competition, that kind of lit a fire underneath me to say, you know what, I think the book needs to be out there so that people know the full story. But that also put a ticking clock on my process, because the movie was ramping up into production, and they had a release date, and so I needed to get going. I had 60 days to write it. And so I wrote 1,000 words a day for 60 days. Not consecutive, I would take the weekends, or one day a week. But that was very, very difficult, and I don't think I could have done that early in my career. It's like running a marathon. You don't just go out and run a marathon, unless you're the guy who first did it and he died. You got to build your muscles up. And part of what I like about writing is, after you've done the reporting, the way I do it with myself is I set myself a goal, and it could be 500 words a day, or for me right now I'm setting 1,000 words a day. And it's a very nice way of structuring your day for something that generally is unstructured, because you're just sitting by yourself in a room. To be a writer is, for those of you who are interested, you have to be very comfortable sitting by yourself in a room for weeks and weeks and weeks. It's like ping pong. Oh, back there. Sorry, hold on one second. Yeah.
Okay, it's like an arm wrestling question thingy.
Sure, yeah.
So listen, like, what's the difference between the inside the thingy and the outside thingy? Can you show the thing? Yeah.
Will you come up here?
That one.
Yeah. We're going to do a demonstration. Okay, shake it out, shake it out. Okay. So, here we go. We're not going to rest. I'm going to show you a little bit. So, what would be better? Well, we'll do it this way first, and then we'll rotate. So most people, when you arm wrestle, they keep their wrists just like this, right? And then you go this way, and you go that way. What people who are amateurs don't realize is that they're missing an entire world of that, you see? Or this. So this right here is the inside move. And when I do that, and I pull back, I extend his arm. And think about breaking a branch. If you try to break it and you're holding tight, it's hard to break. But if you go to the edges, it's easier to break. So here, I'm at a disadvantage because I'm extended. Now I'm at an advantage. So you try to do the inside move when you think you're stronger than the other person and you want to extend them and trap them in your strength. But now let's say that I think that he thinks, it's like the Princess Bride, that he's stronger. He's going to try to trap me, and I'm going to fight right there on his fingers. See, push back with your fingers, and I'm going to go over the top. That's what over the top is called. And then the other thing on that branch, yeah, for those of you who remember over the top, yeah. The branch thing, sometimes people, when they start, they're just like this, but you want to get further out on the hand, so you could do a single cap. It's called a single cap, or a double cap. And now more of my hand is further out on his hand, so I'm further out on the branch. How about a round of applause here? Yeah. There you go. If you break somebody's arm, don't blame me. I'm not responsible. Yes, there's somebody in the back, yeah.
Hi, good afternoon. Well, good evening, really. Okay, so do you believe that with being an undocumented immigrant, that actually holds a gripping fear on trying to grasp U.S. custom and curriculum?
Can you say that again?
Okay, so basically, let's just say, so the gentleman that you spoke about who dropped out of school and went back at 27, went to Michigan State,
Christian, yeah.
and because of how hard it was for him, do you believe, even though, of course, he could go to Michigan State, but when he was younger, do you believe that knowing in the back of his mind that any day could be the day, that kind of stopped them from being who they really could have been?
I think it did, up until, in part, because they came forward and were willing to talk publicly about being undocumented back in 2005. That put a lot of wind in the sails of the Dreamer movement. And that movement took off and created a groundswell of support across the country and in Congress, and led to the passage of the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals Act, DACA. DACA is actually it was an executive order, I should say, that was supported certainly by a lot in Congress. Others definitely opposed it, but was signed by Obama, and it said that if you came into the country as a child and you had a good GPA and you had graduated from a U.S. high school, that they would not enforce deportation on you. So you could apply for it, and I think, I'm trying to remember the numbers, it's something like 1 million people are now currently protected under DACA. Christian is one of them. Though I think now that he's past, it only goes up to a certain age. I'm people who know this much better than I do. But for a period of time, Christian was protected from deportation. And so when he was protected, he did breathe a sigh of relief. It made, it allowed him to consider options that he previously had not considered. Yeah.
Since Spare Parts isn't just the story of the competition, like you said, it's a story that goes far beyond the competition. It doesn't necessarily end happily all the time. And it's the story of several people whom you personally know. Like, how did you know, or like, how did you get that feeling as a writer that like your book was ready and there was nothing to change about it anymore? Did you ever feel that way?
The 60 days were over.
Oh.
Yeah, I was like, pencils down.
Oh.
I had to get it to the printer.
Okay. Gotcha.
Yeah, I didn't have a lot of the luxury. The only luxury I had is that I knew the story very well because I'd been reporting it for 10 years. And so it was something that was very much in my mind. But it didn't go through a lot of there was basically no revision. So what you read is what I wrote.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so I got a question about Tesla. And
Yeah.
I was just wondering, what was it like talking to Elon Musk, and what did you talk about with him?
So I first met him in was actually right around this time in 2004, 05, and it was very early days of Tesla. They were in just a tiny little garage in Silicon Valley. And him and I have stayed in touch over the last 15 years, and we see each other somewhat frequently. I had dinner with him, this is maybe 10-ish years ago. I went down to LA, and I met him at SpaceX, and it was also very early days at SpaceX, and giant rockets, and everybody was like, "This is crazy. There's no way he's going to build a rocket and get to space." And we went out to dinner at a steakhouse near LAX, and we sit down, and I notice on his wrist that he has 3 hospital, those bracelets you get in a hospital. He had 3 of them, and I was like, "What, is everything okay? You've got these hospital bracelets on." And he said, "Oh, it's nothing. My wife just had triplets last night." I was like, "Okay, well, I don't think that relationship's going to work out too well." I was like, you can go. You don't have to be here with me. It's like, no, let's eat. That's a story that I think gives you as much of an insight into his head as anything. Yeah. It's you.
Okay. At the end of the book, when you're talking about the movie, it seems to imply that you don't like that the movie embellished the truth, and that's the motivation behind the book. So I was wondering, in your own work, how did you get dialogue that you weren't present for, or had taken place a long time ago, and embellishment in your own work?
Yeah, another good question. So when I first met them, it was January of 05. So the conversations around what had happened around the competition were very fresh in everybody's minds, because it was only a handful of months later. And the strategy is just kind of like inside baseball journalism. What I would do is I would get everybody together, and then I'd say, "Okay, what happened?" and get them bouncing off each other and kind of fact-checking each other. So somebody would say, well, I would start and be like, "Okay, so you got there and you unpacked, and anybody say anything as you unpacked?" And Chris would be like, "Yeah, Oscar said this." And Oscar said, no, that was Luis. And I looked at Luis, and Luis would be like, "Yeah, I said that." Right? So you go back and forth until everybody agrees that, yes, that is what happened. That's the best you can do. Somebody over here now? Raise your hand if you have it. There we go. Yeah.
Of all the articles and stories you've written, which one was your favorite and the one that you cherish the most?
I mean, this one has been very much a part of my life, but in many ways, all of them are. For better or for worse. Like, some are unforgettable for different reasons. The conflict reporting is hard to forget. The wars are hard to forget. But I would say this one. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
Like you said about the wars, what was it like for you in Fallujah, and have you ever been anywhere more dangerous than that?
Yeah. Fallujah that was my first time in a conflict zone. I didn't really know what I was doing. Luckily, I got paired up with Ed Kashi, who was a National Geographic photographer who's Kurdish, and he had spent a lot of time in northern Iraq, and he totally knew the ropes, and so I just kind of tagged along beside him. It was so rushed that when Wired sent me that I just got basically a one-way ticket to Kuwait, and I was a unilateral, which means I wasn't attached to any military unit and was basically hitchhiking. And I realized pretty quickly that I needed a flak jacket, and I didn't have one. And so I called my editor back in California. I was like, "Can you FedEx me a flak jacket?" And so he did, but it got caught up in customs. And so I was waiting in Kuwait City trying to get the flak jacket out of customs, and it never did. And so finally I just went. And I was in this truck at one point when people started shooting at us. and there was an extra helmet in the cab of the truck. So I took the helmet, and I was trying to decide what's the best. The bullets are coming from that side. What's the best use of the helmet? You know, do you do this, or what I ended up doing was putting it on my butt, and just like if that was where I was going to get shot, that would be the best, you know, protection. Keep my head as far away from it. But yeah, so that was an early education in conflict reporting. I was in Libya the week before the consulate fell in Benghazi. I was in southern Colombia during one of the last FARC uprisings. So I've been in some conflict. What else? Maybe one more here. How about one more? Maybe let's end on a more positive note.
How do you feel about the fact that you decided to send a reply to the email or respond to them sparked a change such as the DACA Act, and what's something that you can tell us about the boys that wasn't included on the book, like a little insight or something, an extra story that can help us learn more about them?
So the email, yeah, I mean, it would have been very easy for me to just delete it, and then I wouldn't be here, and none of you have had to read the book, and you read some other book. It's hard to tell how things shake out, you know, how our lives unfold. One little email has such an impact. And then something about the guys, Alan and Freddie, I mean, this is about the teachers. Alan retired a handful of years ago and is now bicycling around the United States kind of continuously. And Freddie is about to retire this year. And I am very curious to see what will happen with the robotics team and the legacy that they built, the impact that they had. I mean, imagine, if you want to talk about impact, don't forget about that email that I got. Think about those two teachers and the impact that they've had on hundreds and hundreds of students, and the impact that those students have had on hundreds and hundreds of people, and that ripple effect of just two people who decided not to just teach remedial math and remedial English to undocumented students, but rather to tell them that they could do more and challenge them to, in fact, do the impossible. Think about the impact of that. Thank you all very much. I'll be over here if you want to talk to me. Thank you.